The U.S. has launched investigations into 60 economies over what it calls failures to address forced labor in supply chains. The move comes as President Donald Trump's administration seeks to rebuild tariff pressure after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down his global levies last month. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer says the probes will examine whether foreign governments have taken sufficient steps to block imports of goods produced with forced labor, and how any failure affects American workers and businesses. The list includes Singapore and major U.S. allies, such as Canada, Australia, and the European Union, as well as China and Russia. These investigations follow a separate announcement that Washington will probe 16 trading partners over alleged excess industrial capacity. Both investigations fall under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974. To help us understand what this all means, Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation, joins us live. Deb, thank you for making the time to join us today. Could you help us understand how these fresh trade probes are different to the ones announced earlier this week?
Well, we've had a couple of different changes in trade policy. So one is originally to use something called IEEPA, the Emergency Powers Act. That's the one that gave globally applied tariffs. That was struck down by the Supreme Court, as you noted. It was replaced by a sort of temporary 10% across the board. That expires in July. And so between now and July, the U.S. administration seems determined to rebuild that wall. And one way to do so is to use different tariff rules. And ultimately, at the end of this investigation process, which is going to come very fast, and certainly before July 27th, when these temporary tariffs expire, we will have presumably new tariffs in place. And it may be the case that they exactly line up with the tariffs that you had under the original IEEPA statute.
How exactly will he do that? How will he replace some of the reciprocal tariffs that the Supreme Court has already struck down?
Well, here's an example. I can't say that this is how USTR is thinking, but Singapore is currently subject to a 10% tariff. It was subject to that under IEEPA. It's currently subject to that under this temporary hold. If you don't do something, then tariffs on Singapore will fall to zero at the end of this temporary holding period. And I think this administration doesn't want that to happen. So how do they ensure that it doesn't happen? They put Singapore in two ongoing probes, the one that was earlier this week on excess capacity and the one announced just a few hours ago on forced labor. This is not to say, just to be clear, that they're saying that Singapore itself has forced labor. They're saying that Singapore, I guess, has taken insufficient steps to make sure that supply chains that come through and across out of Singapore are free of forced labor, right? Because this is a very expansive, 60 different countries were hit by this one this morning. You have to show that not only are you not practicing forced labor, that you are policing against incoming forced labor products, but also that your supply chains are clean and free of forced labor. This is going to be very challenging. And my suspicion is that at the end of it, they could say Singapore doesn't do a sufficiently good job, however that's defined. And guess what? Here's a 10% tariff given to Singaporean imports into the United States, starting on whatever it is between May and July.
Is there a chance that these new duties could be stacked on top of the blanket 10%? I mean, I know you mentioned that they're set to expire. There was a 150-day expiry date. But Mr. Trump said during his State of the Union address that they weren't going to expire and that they would remain in place. So how exactly would this all work?
Well, it is terribly confusing, but let me just say that the current 10% on this temporary rule called 122 are set to expire on July 27th. I think it would be difficult for the administration to extend them. They could cancel that temporary case. They could open a new temporary case, but there's going to be some real legal challenges in the US around that. So their preference is to move everybody who they want to tariff into new categories, which is why we have seen these two launches of Section 301 this week. We may see more coming soon on different areas like digital trade, areas in environment, pollution levels. It's very unclear, but there should be a lot of them coming, I think. And there are also sector-specific tariffs, some of which we've already seen in steel, aluminum, copper, autos, auto parts. lumber, sofas, but others could be in the pipeline, including semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, electrical products, drones, critical minerals, et cetera. And so we have two different authorities that this administration is trying to use as more durable, long-term tariff authorities that will not be easily overturned by the Supreme Court.
So what does this mean for all the trade deals that have already been finalized? Will they still remain in place?
Isn't that the great question? No one knows. I mean, currently the U.S. is arguing the deal is the deal. We agreed to it, we negotiated it, and in fact, if you were, say, let's Malaysia at 19%, you should be happy that currently, under this temporary hold, you're only at 10%. You're actually getting a discount, right? Because you're, I don't know, a good player. We'll see what happens at the end of this, but you can imagine that those partners that did go through the process of negotiating a trade deal with this administration are now saying, well, what was the point of that if you're just going to change the rules and the authorities on us at any time? And when you're asking us to do even more, potentially, to get out from under the upcoming Section 301 or 232 tariffs that we haven't even seen yet or that just got dropped this week. I think we really need to get more clarity from the U.S. The timelines are super short, and so comments are already opening next week. Any affected businesses should be putting comments into Washington about what they think about these new policies. I can't promise, given the speed with which this is being conducted, that they will read your comments, but at least they're on record. And some future administration especially could dig them out and say, we're going to reverse this decision as a result of our increased investigation into these topics. We don't know, but my point is we really need to do all you can to get information, to be part of that process, and then we will have to see how this unfolds, but it's going to come much faster than I think people imagined.
A lot of uncertainty, as you mentioned, and, countries really don't know what's going to be next. Could we expect some governments to maybe push back, given how quickly things are changing with the Trump administration?
I think there will be some. In particular, I can imagine the European Union being annoyed that they were just accused of failing to look at forced labor when they've been very active on this front. The Chinese have a very important meeting they're supposed to have with Donald Trump directly. And I assume, again, that the Chinese will say, hello, let's discuss this in more detail, particularly the forced labor issue, which is extremely sensitive for Beijing. So there will be a few places that might have government-to-government conversations. But there's always a reluctance, as you can imagine, to be too vocal in front of Donald Trump in particular, because the consequences could be even more extreme if you raise issues. And so I think governments are going to be cautious again. But the more burdens you put on governments, the more burdens that get put on their companies, the more incentive I think foreign governments have to actually stand up and raise these issues with Donald Trump directly and with his administration as well. And so, where is that tipping point? I don't know. We haven't really seen it yet, but we also didn't see people moving from these unusual authorities like IEEPA to these much more durable authorities like 301 and 232. 301 cases, the tariffs that get imposed on that could be in place for decades. And so if you're not acting now in the interests of your population and your companies, then you might be stuck with a tariff that's very high for a long period to come.
I want to turn to the U.S. and China. They're supposed to hold talks this weekend in Paris, and this comes ahead of an expected meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in Beijing. How do you expect this to play out? Will the two superpowers be able to maintain their trade truce?
Well, I think it's gotten a lot harder. I mean, it was always going to be challenging. And I think that the lodging of two new cases that include China on industrial capacity, excess industrial capacity, and now forced labor is going to add additional complications to that agenda. And so I am not convinced that this meeting is even going to take place. I think it's difficult to do so in the context of an ongoing conflict in Iran. I can imagine the optics are a bit weird, like if they're having a lovely time together in Beijing while we have American service people, crashing as an example, in Iraq, that's going to be a bit of an issue. So I'm not certain that this meeting will take place. If it does, it is going to be much more narrowly focused, skinnier, faster, shorter, and less pomp and circumstance than I think we expected. And it will potentially be even more contentious given U.S. actions taken this week.
Thank you, Deborah, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation.